Carter says, do you remember seeing the first roots of woke? Yes, there's a lot there, Carter. So let me, first of all right, so George W. Bush was president when I was first getting politically active. And it was like the very end of the Bush administration. It was pretty clear the country was going to move leftward. Barack Obama had kind of made a national name for himself. At the Democrat convention in 2004, he'd given a speech that had really gone over well with viewers. And so I remember there were two events, the U.S. social forums that were held. One was in Georgia and Atlanta, and one was in Detroit. And these were like little conventions for leftists. I went to both of them. I went to Georgia for the U.S. Social Forum, and I went to Detroit for the U.S. Social Forum. And I remember when I went to the one in Georgia, I was 19 years old. I had just joined the Workers' World Party, and they needed somebody to work the booths and hand out their leaflets at these gatherings that they had. And I remember that, all the communist groups were there, and they had their literature tables. But the bulk of the people that were at that convention, at the U.S. Social Forum, were not in any communist group. They were NGO employees. And that was the first time I'd ever been exposed to this type of person, right? There was, and it was weird because I'd be handing out leaflets to all the people at the U.S. Social Forum in Atlanta. Oh, we're going to have a workshop and all this. And I would talk to these people, and they were, they had pink hair and they had nose rings, and they were older than me, right? I was 19. And I remember I would talk to them, and they weren't members of any communist group. They worked at Planned Parenthood. They worked at Students Against Sweatshops. They worked at Jobs with Justice. They worked at various like liberal activist paid gigs, paid jobs. The Sylvia Rivera Law Project was a group of transgender activists that I saw. And it was like there were all these people that were older than me that, they were at this convention where every communist group was there selling their newspaper and had literature, but they were there and they were working for these nonprofits, and they were not interested in the same things I was interested in. They were interested. They were all, first of all, they were overwhelmingly white, all of them. And they were wealthy. They were from wealthy backgrounds. A lot of them were lawyers, not all of them. A lot of them had worked in a law firm. There were a lot of law firms and a lot of liberal NGOs. And you talk to them, and they were from money, and they were very interested in LGBT. And they were very interested in, racial, like academic racial stuff, like Black studies, and the way racial oppression portrays itself in white feminist literature, or whatever you want to call it. And it was very academic, and it was also very, very, very not populist in its style. And it was very, very, what would be the word? It was very like, it was almost like tourism. Like they were interested in like obscure ways to be transgender. They were interested in, like Puerto Rican lesbians, and how like the experience of Puerto Rican lesbians is different than the experience of white lesbians, or they were interested in this kind of weird stuff. And they were very, very, there were a lot of women in those circles that were very triggered all the time. That was the other thing I remember. I went to a workshop at the U.S. Social Forum that was put on by the Committees of Correspondence. I was interested in communist groups. That's why I was at the U.S. Social Forum. I was there with the Workers' World Party. I was interested in communism. And I remember the Committees of Correspondence for Democracy and Socialism, which is a breakaway from the Communist Party, they had a workshop about what they stood for, about how do we move towards socialism in America. And I went to the workshop, and the workshop, it was a PowerPoint presentation, and it was about how Republicans are fascists. Republicans are fascists, and they're dangerous and all of that, and we have to defeat the Republicans. And then once we defeat the Republicans, once the Republican Party is just like demolished, which is not how a two-party system works, but once the Republicans are defeated, then the Democrats will divide between the pro-monopoly Democrats and the anti-monopoly Democrats. And the anti-monopoly Democrats will gradually start to implement socialist policies. And we won't call it socialism in America. And there won't be a revolution. It won't be like a moment where, there's a revolution. It'll just be like gradually we'll get free healthcare, we'll get free education, and there'll be some like vague name for it. And it'll just kind of gradually happen. And like 100 years from now, we'll basically be living in socialism, but we won't call it that here in America. And it'll be really democratic. And it'll be really, it'll look nothing like communist governments around the world, and it'll be, it'll have a big emphasis on LGBT. And I remember sitting in that workshop and just thinking, what the hell is this? The Republican Party is not just going to go away, right? And I just thought the whole thing was weird. So I raised my hand and I said, well, isn't there an issue? It's not an issue of defeating Republicans. It's an issue of like power and like, what about the state and stuff like that? I raised my hand and I said this. After I spoke, before they answered my question, this woman behind me who had a nose ring spoke, and she was like 10 years older than me. And she spoke, right? And she had a nose ring, and she had like short hair that was like, combed over her head. It wasn't purple, I don't think. And I'm so triggered by that guy's talking about power and authority. I don't want anyone to have power and authority over anyone. And it's like she's about to cry in response to my question. I'm like, Jesus Christ. I'm like, what's wrong with this? And she's up there, that's what scares me about communist groups. And then she's like attacking the Committees of Correspondence group for having me there asking the question. I asked, well, what about the state? What about the government? What about power? I don't think the Republicans are just going to go away. And then they hand the microphone to her and she's like, oh my God, I'm triggered by power and scary authoritarian men that are going to, and she's like having a meltdown. And I'm just like, what? I had never seen anybody like that before. Right. And that's now like, that's what all the woke protesters are. They're that. Right. And that was like, I remember thinking like, what the hell is that? Right. So then the mic went back to the speaker. And the woman who was putting on the workshop, she looked at me and this kind of condescending smile. She's like, I thought the same thing when I was your age, young man. We're not going to be storming the Winter Palace. We're not the Bolsheviks. It's going to be just a gradual process, one step at a time. It was what I was hearing was Bernstein, right? It was the movement is everything, the goal is nothing. And the woman I was hearing it from, she was probably a real communist. She was just like, a reform. She was like a Communist Party USA revisionist, basically. She wasn't triggered by me talking about the state and all that. And she'd read all those books. And she this was a woman who remembered the 60s. This was an older woman. And she had been a real communist at one point, and she wasn't triggered by what I was saying. She just didn't believe in it anymore. She'd become a reformist social democrat. But the woman behind me, I was like, what the hell is this? Right. And this woman who's older than me is like, she's like triggered and having a meltdown by my question about state power. And that was woke. The other thing that I remember was, so I was in the Workers' World Party, and the Workers' World Party had a woman in it named, well, I shouldn't say a woman. It had a person in it who presented as male, but was, you called them she, because they wanted to raise awareness. And she was Leslie Feinberg. Leslie Feinberg was like the first transgender activist in American history, and she was with them. And Leslie Feinberg was like a saint at these events. She was like a celebrity because she was the first transgender activist, and she was going around speaking at all the colleges about being transgender. And she was, in those years, she was almost having like a panic attack because she supported North Korea and she supported Iran and she supported she was a Stalinist communist, basically. I mean, she was a Marxiste, and she was horrified that the LGBT movement was turning into a vehicle to spread imperialism. And she spent the final years of her political activity before she got Lyme disease and was inactive for many years before she died. She spent like the final years of her life going around like yelling at the LGBT movement for being pro-imperialist. But even within the Workers' World Party, there was this odd culture of like, you can't disagree with someone if they are more oppressed than you, right? And it was weird. And I had not seen this in other communist groups. The older communist groups weren't like that. The Revolutionary Communist Party, they were almost the opposite, right? They had us going to black churches with newspapers. God is the original fascist. And, they had us, we were quite insensitive, and we followed the great white leader, Bob Avakian. And, he was the savior of black people and whatever. I mean, they were quite insensitive on racial matters. But in the Workers' World Party, there was this whole thing of like, if a woman says something and you're a man, you're not allowed to disagree with them, or you're being sexist. If a black person says something and you disagree with them and you're white, then you're not allowed to do that. You're being sexist. And, I was joining the group at the time, and part of the hazing in the group, if you're a white person, is they accuse you of being racist, and when they don't mean it, and you have to you have to not fight back, basically. It's like they test you. And so, I was experiencing that. And I remember the one time, I was not a full member, I don't think, at the time of the US Social Forum, but I remember we were planning a workshop. They had a youth workshop at the US Social Forum, and I had sent an email with suggestions about what the workshop should be. And then they had one of the other youth who was on the email list, who was black, a woman who was 3 or 4 years older than me, call me up on the phone. Excuse me? How did you think that was appropriate to send that email? I'm like, what do you mean? I just said that I think we should do this or that. Well, that was condescending, and we don't need your white man opinions. And, it was, stuff like that. And that was just kind of the culture of the Workers' World Party. That's how they developed. It was pretty toxic. And I learned after a while being in the group that there were just certain red lines you couldn't cross, right? If they played that card, right, you had to stop talking immediately, right? And that there was no defense, right? If you were saying something and then they said you're a white man, you have to shut up, And I learned that the hard way, and I just learned that okay, there are just certain limits of what I can do in this group, right? And I was very committed to being in a communist group, and I believed in what I was doing. And, so it was like, this was a group I could be with. They let me write for their newspaper. They let me, speak at some of their conferences. And I was in Cleveland at that point organizing. They had a newspaper I could distribute. And it was just like, okay, this group has kind of an unhealthy, toxic culture. There's a lot of internal, yelling at each other and stuff, but whatever. I just thought, okay, I'll take it, whatever. And then I moved to New York. That's a whole nother story, but is that woke? Yeah, that's woke. But this was, again, before woke. This was an old school communist group that still did talk about workers control the means of production. However, fast forward 5 or 6 years, one thing that would happen in communist groups, I'm fine, Gala, much love. But one thing that would happen in communist groups, and I remember this, was so people would, one thing that happens, and a lot of communist groups this happens, is college-aged young people, they join communist groups, and they then go and get jobs at labor unions, right? The labor unions hire left-wing young people. And they hire them to be labor union staffers, labor union employees. And so there were a lot of people in the Workers' World Party who went to they were in college, they were in the University of North Carolina or whatever. And then they got hired by hotel employees, restaurant employees, HERE, or they got hired by the United Food and Commercial Workers or the AFL-CIO outright. They got hired by some labor union, right? They got hired by a labor union. And the labor unions, they do these like summer camps for their employees where they take them to, like, they have the unions own property. They have, and like in Michigan, I think there's a big United Auto Workers camp, right? It's just like a summer camp that they own. It's like I don't know what you want to call it, a dacha or whatever. I mean, it's just like they have this place in upstate Michigan that they own. And if you're going to be a UAW employee, or if you're going to be an employee of one of these unions, you go to like a place in the woods and you do like a 2-week training program. And those training programs are very woke, right? And they do the whole, if you hear me clap once, if you hear me clap twice, if you hear me clap 3 times, right? And they kind of like, they do these kind of like group bonding activities with these people, and they teach them how to organize. Or they teach them these methods of organizing that are very ineffective. I mean, the labor movement in the United States is, it's like weaker than it's ever been. So these methods are the great way to organize. I mean, give me a break. We haven't seen a big victory for the labor movement since like the Teamsters organized UPS in 1995. Okay. Like the labor movement is very, very weak, but they have these like very textbook ways of organizing people. And they do the very infantile, if you hear me clap once, if you hear me clap twice, we don't raise our hand at the meeting. We have this cute little bouncy ball that we throw to people. And they do that, and the kind of infantilization of organizing, it's like 5th grade. That people would learn that in the labor unions when they would get a union job. Their training would do that, and then they would take that into the communist group, right? And that happened in every communist group. They would learn this kind of like kindergarten organizing style. And then they would bring it into the communist group and be like, well, I learned these very new professional techniques that we have in our organizing the union. And they would bring it into the communist group, and they would start acting that way. And I am convinced, so it's been revealed that some of that stuff actually came from Scientology, right? Some of that stuff originated in Scientology. Harvey Jackins and that whole thing. The privilege walk is an exercise that they do at those things where it's like, if your family had more than this amount of money, take 1 step forward. If you did this, then you take another step forward. And it's like it's like whoever's the furthest ahead, is the most privileged person or something. They do these kind of like infantile, workshops, but then there's also this element of like oversharing, right? Where you talk about, very personal things, and you talk about, I don't know, it's weird. It's like, so on the one hand, they're kind of treating you like a child. On the other hand, it kind of turns into group therapy. And then there's a real frown on actual knowledge, right? There's this feeling that knowing facts is racist. Knowing data, being able to quote books and all of that is somehow making other people uncomfortable. And if you go to one of these, if you go to this kind of space, it's weird. It's just like, it's like a method of running a group, right? And it would come from the labor bureaucracy. They would bring it into the communist groups, and it's like, so we're all gonna, if you hear me clap once, if you hear me clap twice, we're gonna sit in a circle and talk about our favorite ice cream or something like that. And then and then there's also, we're going to talk about like deeply emotional experiences. Women get up and talk about when they were sexually harassed and how bad they felt about it. People talk about discrimination, and it's like, so we're going to, like, at the same time that we're acting like kindergarten, we're also going to get up and have people start crying while they talk about ways that they were mistreated. And then there's also, then if you know anything, that is, no, we don't do that here, right? If you know actual data about the economy and how it's organized, no, we don't do that here. If you've read Marxist books, you understand facts about Lenin and history, no, we don't do that here. We do these kind of kindergarten bonding activities. We cry a lot and talk about our painful childhood memories. And then, and it is some kind of CIA thing. I'm convinced this came from the intelligence agencies. It's some kind of brainwashing thing that they developed. And it's really anti-intellectual. It is like knowing anything about communism, knowing anything about economics, knowing anything about anything is, we don't do that here, right? And they immediately, if you know anything about, especially if this is a communist group, you're supposed to be talking about communism. If you know anything about communism, they immediately label that autistic, white, and male, which it's not, right? There's plenty of black people who know all about it. There's, but they immediately like, no, we don't do communism here. That's autistic white male. No. We're interested in and this kindergarten stuff. This is what women like. You're too male. You're using aggressive male words, and you're too, all knowing all these books and all. That's a white people thing. White people read books. People of color don't read books. That's right. It's weird, right? In the name of their like social justice, it's like, you're not allowed to actually believe in communism. Instead, we do this kind of kindergarten stuff, and we cry about our emotional experiences. And it's very, very odd. And all the communist groups started getting this way. Starting in around the time of Occupy Wall Street, like 2011, 2012, 2013, all the communist groups got this way. The Communist Party USA got this way. The Workers' World Party got this way. PSL is like this. It is just like this. The Freedom Road Socialist Organization, all of them got this way, right? And it got weird. And it was, no, RCP is definitely not like this, but that's a whole nother story. But it got weird, and it was that NGO culture coming into the communist groups is really what it was, right? It was, all the NGOs were already like that. I didn't know that because I don't come from, I didn't grow up in New York City. I didn't grow up in Los Angeles. I don't come from the wealthy families that, these people are from wealthy backgrounds. They've all got relatives who went to Harvard and Yale. And there's an ethnic component to this. Again, there are people of all different ethnic backgrounds and all of that, but there's a certain ethnic group, and I think you know who I'm talking about, that is very prominent among them, and they're very anti-Israel and all of that. So I'm not saying this is all a big conspiracy, but there is a certain ethnic group that is very highly represented among them, for historical reasons that make all kinds of perfect sense, right? It's not a big conspiracy, but there is a certain ethnic group that is highly represented. I'm going to get canceled for saying that probably, but who cares? Right. And, they're from New York City. They're from Los Angeles. They're working at Planned Parenthood or Jobs with Justice or Students Against Sweatshops or a labor union. And, and they're making pretty good money. A lot of them are making six figures. Most of them are making six figures at these well-paying jobs that are paid for by the Rockefellers and the Ford Foundation and all of that. And part of doing these jobs is they go through this brainwashing kind of at their jobs, right? They go through this kind of brainwashing in order to work at their jobs. And it was like this stuff started seeping into the actual communist organizations, right? And the actual communist groups were not like this. They had their own thing. um you know um but then this stuff from the labor union bureaucracy and from the feminist LGBT Sylvia Rivera Law Project, and I don't know which Planned Parenthood and all this stuff started seeping into the communist groups. And the communist groups, they just got toxic. I mean, you couldn't be an actual communist and be in those groups. And it's just like this culture of, if you know anything about communism, if you know anything about economics, if you know anything about history, you're a racist, sexist, autistic white male. And like, we just kind of cry about our emotions and we throw the bouncy ball. And yeah, I mean, that's what I consider to be woke, right? It is this kind of oppression politics, oppression theory. We talk about oppression and how unfair it is. We talk about different types of oppression in this weird academic, like, what is the experience of Puerto Rican transgendered people compared to, and I don't know, that when you talk about woke politics, that's what I consider woke politics. Okay. And that stuff started, that's kind of my experience of seeing that stuff gain dominance. I think what it was that after the failure of the Bush administration, the liberals, the CIA regime change apparatus that runs the Color Revolution NGOs, they got the upper hand. They got the upper hand. And so in order to have the upper hand, they needed to really make sure there was no genuine communist politics. If you look at the political crisis of the 1960s, what happened was McCarthyism had come in after the Second World War. The Communist Party was they were part of the Roosevelt coalition. And so McCarthyism came in, and McCarthyism just crushed the Communist Party. But McCarthyism turned into a vehicle for the military industrial complex and some middle class elements to fight the American establishment. And so the ultra rich, the Rockefellers and others, pushed back against McCarthyism with their foundations, with the Ford Foundation, with McGeorge Bundy and all of that. And they pushed back against it, and they funded the civil rights movement and other things to push back. And they created an opening. And out of that, you got the Black Panthers and you got Students for a Democratic Society. And you had an actual communist insurgency in the United States. By 1968, 69, there was a genuine, solid anti-imperialist bloc to some degree within certain layers of U.S. society. And so then, as things stabilized, you had the rise of neoconservatism, and it was kind of gotten rid of. And I think what it was, like generals fighting the last war, they wanted to make sure that as they boosted the left, there was no danger of the left, of an actual left asserting itself. And I think that's really what it was. They wanted to make sure that this time, whatever left they boosted was not going to actually become a genuine anti-imperialist movement, right? And that's what that was about. It was like, okay, we're gonna, liberals are gonna have the upper hand, and the regime change, color revolution, Eastern establishment is going to have the upper hand, but they need to make sure, absolutely make sure, that they do not, it's interesting. I know people who went to Cuba, right? The Venceremos brigades, they go to Cuba every year. They defy the travel ban. It's like they go as an act of civil disobedience. They violate the travel ban. They go to Cuba every year. And people talked about how in the Venceremos brigades, like every year in the Venceremos brigades, they have a big fight, and there's like a witch hunt, and that, they accuse somebody of being racist or something like that. And there's like a woke And it started happening in the Vince Ramos brigades every year, that they gang up on somebody on the delegation and decide they're racist and sexist. And and it's clearly, the Vince Ramos brigades, most of the people involved, I think, are just genuine people that support Cuba. But of course, the Vince Ramos brigades, like anything like that, is going to be crawling with informants and spies and all of that. And I noticed that that's one thing, starting in like the early 2000s, every year the Vince Ramos brigades would have some kind of woke fight where, a bunch of the people on the trip would all gang up on somebody, usually a white male, and accuse them of being racist, sexist, homophobic, or something like that. And they would, there'd be an ugly, like, show trial in the Vince Ramos brigades, an ugly, like, call out struggle session in the Vince Ramos brigades. And I am convinced that's part of where this came from. The CIA, was experimenting. How do we manipulate left-wing people, right? How do we control left-wing people? How do we, they say in intelligence circles, you're an asset, not when you're consciously working for the intelligence agency, but when they know how to predict your behavior, right? And a lot of the communist groups in America are like that. The government doesn't tell them what to do, but the government knows exactly what they will do under any given circumstance. They're not worried about them, and they're actually kind of useful to some degree or other, right? Black Lives Matter, a genuine uprising among the black community against police brutality, but it was nudged and used to depose Donald Trump because Donald Trump was considered a threat to American imperialism. Well, how were they able to do that? Well, I mean, it's very clear that they knew how a lot of the key actors in Black Lives Matter could be manipulated. They didn't call up all the groups involved. They just knew how to push on them. And then Black Lives Matter Incorporated was funded by George Soros. Those were all George Soros staffers, former Teach for America teachers. That whole thing was completely, but then on top of that, there were a lot of communist groups that were involved in Black Lives Matter, but those groups had been so messed with and so wokeified, and they knew how to nudge them so well that they went along with it, right? It's very clear that, right, there was a genuine anger in the black community about police brutality, and then there was a strategic decision by the ruling class to weaponize it against Donald Trump. That was very clear, to create instability, to set the stage for Donald Trump losing the 2020 election during the pandemic, and to control the rising anger among the population during the pandemic, and to separate the economic anger about the pandemic from from the black community, right? To make it so, white people are anti-vaccine and black people are mad about police brutality, and to kind of fracture. I mean, it served a purpose, right? And that's the thing. I don't think, I think many people were horrified by what happened to George Floyd. It wasn't all a big conspiracy. Something happened, and the way these things work is that, something happens and then they nudge a certain direction. And that's the game that intelligence agencies play. It's like, how do they have certain things they want to push, certain narratives they want to push about different countries, about politics, about changing the culture in certain ways. And things happen and people do things, but they are there kind of pushing whatever does happen, pushing what people say in a certain way. And the less fingerprints they have, the better, right? The more if they're identified as doing it, it's not going to work, right? The more that it looks just natural and spontaneous, the better. That's how these things work. So I don't know. I mean, it's just, we can talk all about this, but at the end of the day, the anti-populist left, right? The anti-populist left is very, it is very much, it's paid for by the Rockefellers and by the Ford Foundation and all of that. And it developed kind of a weird mind control infantilization tactic, that it developed, and that kind of seeped in and became what leftism is. And anti-populism, let's just talk about that. Anti-populism is a big part of the Zionist mindset. Zionism is based on the idea that Jews are so special, they're just so much smarter than everybody else, they're just so much better than everybody else, that they're always going to be persecuted, so they have to have their own country in Israel. That's the premise of Zionism. Zionism says deep down, non-Jews are all, Nazis, right? Deep down, non-Jews are all Nazis, and so that's why you have to create Israel, so Jews can go there and get away from all of us that are all just a bunch of Nazis, right? So the idea is the people are the enemy. Zionism is the fullest expression of what Lenin called the spirit of the ghetto. Lenin called out the Bundists. The Bundists in Russia were not Zionists. They were Jews, but they were socialists. But they said we have to have a separate socialist group for Jews because we're always going to be persecuted and all of that. And Lenin, who was himself Jewish, said, no, I want nothing to do with this. This is a mindset. This is the spirit of the ghetto. And this is a problem. And I think that part of this woke thing, and and a lot of the people that join these circles are not themselves Jewish, right? I understand Vosh is not Jewish, right? I mean, many people said he was, but I understand he's Polish. But it doesn't matter, because you go to one of these woke events where everyone's getting up and crying about their feelings, and we're doing this kindergarten stuff, right? This kindergarten thing, and it's like it cultivates a mindset where you're like vulnerable and afraid of people and triggered by mass movements, power, facts, history. All of that is scary, fascism, and you get into this like triggered scare, like that woman behind me, right? I don't know if she was Jewish or not. It doesn't matter. It's not the point. It's not about ethnicity, right? That woman who, when I asked a question about Lenin at the beginning of this question that you asked me, Carter, that woman, when I asked the question about Lenin and she's like, oh my God, I'm scared. That mindset, that's what that kind of brainwashing that the woke people do, that's what it cultivates. That woman may not have been Jewish, but it cultivates a mindset that is a Zionist mindset. It is the spirit of the ghetto mindset. The people are the enemy. Everyone's out to get us, so we need our safe space. That's what Israel is. Israel's a giant safe space, right? Because all of human history has just been a big conspiracy to persecute the Jews because they're just so much better than all of us, right? I mean, they're just the greatest people ever, and we're just a bunch of evil, inferior Nazis deep down. And so clearly they need their giant safe space in Palestine, to be safe from all of us inferior, hateful bigots, I mean, Zionism is wokeism, right? It is the ultimate wokeism, right? It is anti-populism. It is the belief that the people are the enemy. It is the belief that any mass movement of any kind is inherently Nazi and fascist. Zionism is wokeism, I mean, that's what it is. And so, and that the woke shops, they're cultivating you to think like a liberal Zionist, right? Conservative Zionists are just white supremacists. They admire apartheid in South Africa. Some of them, that's a different thing. Ben Shapiro, the Netanyahu crowd are a different thing. But liberal Zionism is wokeism. It is, oh my God, everyone's just so mean to us. Every country we go to, we get persecuted and all this, and so we have to have a special safe space to get away from all the inferior ones. When they worship Jesus, what they're saying is that we're all Christ killers. That's that. Have you ever seen a crucifix? That's a thing they wear around their neck to say that we killed their God, to say killed the Jews. That's what a crucifix means. It means kill the Jews. They say that's what liberal Zionists are like. I have met them. I live in New York City. I'm surrounded by liberal Zionists. They think that Christianity, I was told by one of my Zionist coworkers, all religions except for Judaism are just an excuse to kill Jews. That's what he said to me. All religions except for Judaism are an excuse to kill Jews. That the crucifix is, Christians wear that because they're saying that Jews killed Jesus and that's why they hate Jews. I mean, they live in this weird world where all of humanity is out to get them. All of humanity is out to get them because they're just better than everybody else, because they're the superior group and everyone else is just not as smart as they are, and everyone else is just, and so they need this giant safe space in the desert to keep them safe from all the, I mean, look, and these are the kind of things that people get mad at me for saying. And I just have to call it what it is. I mean, Zionism is toxic and evil, but leftism has been taken over by soft Zionism, or this, what Lenin called the spirit of the ghetto. It has. And that's a big part of wokeism. A big part of wokeism is this, the spirit of the ghetto, I guess, the Zionist mindset, right? And it's the liberal form of it, right? The conservative Zionists, they're just like, we're civilized Europeans. All these Muslims are inferior. They're inferior brown people. Look at South Africa. It was so much better when the settlers ran it. I mean, they're just racist. And they all like Trump. They all like evangelicals. They like Donald Trump. They're a different brand altogether. And a lot of them are not white Europeans, or they're all white, but a lot of them are not from America or Britain. A lot of the conservative Zionists tend to be from Eastern Europe. They tend to be from Russia. They tend to be from Czechoslovakia, Romania, places like that. And they are just like, they're just like, we are white and Arabs and Muslims are inferior. And that's what they think. And they like Trump. And that's Ben Shapiro's crowd. That's Sheldon Adelson's crowd. That's a different thing. But the bulk of American and British Zionists are liberal Zionists that have this permanent victim mindset. They're triggered, they're scared, and anyway, I don't know. I've said this all to you all a million times, but it's a big part of when we talk about what woke is. I mean, that's a big part of it. And so it is what it is, It is what it is. And that a big part of woke, let me just say this, a big part of it is getting people to define themselves by their trauma. Getting people to define themselves by how they're a victim, getting people to think of themselves as victims. And what are they doing in those woke shops when they're throwing the bouncy ball and you're talking about your favorite ice cream and your pizza? They're making you, they're regressing you to childhood. They're making you feel powerless, right? They're subtly reducing you to being a child. When you're a child, you have no power. Right. And so they're reducing you to being a child. Right. Right. And then after they reduce you to a childlike state, then from there, they're triggering you. And they get a bunch of people to talk about the times they were sexually harassed, the times they were abused, and so now they've gotten you to a vulnerable state where you feel powerless. And then they're going to trigger you, and all your painful memories and all of that are going to come back. And you're going to be scared of the world. And so you're like a scared child. You're going to follow your parent, right? You're just going to obey your parent. Keep me safe, parent. Keep me safe, parent. And they get you into that mindset of, they said that racists, have to be banned from Facebook, and that if you support Russia, you're racist. So we just have to support them banning Russia because, Kamala Harris, maybe she did some bad things, but Donald Trump is just so scary. And they get you into this mindset. It's really an intense psychological manipulation. And I'm sure the CIA and the intelligence agencies, they workshopped this over and over again. They tried it on different people, and they pulled from here and they pulled from there, and they mixed it up, and this is how these things work, right? And this is where woke came from. But the main thing, the reason that what we're doing with the Center for Political Innovation, we're not woke, is I don't want you to see yourself as a victim. I don't. I want you to see yourself as a creative, successful, powerful person. I want you to be confident and proud of who you are. I don't want you to be defined by your trauma. I don't want you to see yourself as a victim, and I don't want you to be scared of your fellow human beings. I want you to be proud of who you are. I want you to be creative. I want you to meet other people and have great connections with you. I want you to be successful. So I must be a fascist, right? Clearly, I must be a fascist, right? But no, CPI, we're trying to build people up. Right? We want people to establish real connections, to be proud of who they are, to be confident in their life. We don't want people to define themselves by their identity, by their oppression, by their trauma. We don't want to reduce people to childlike states. We don't want, we're not doing any of these evil things that the CIA and the intelligence agencies do. We're actually doing the opposite. If CPI is going to succeed as an organization, I need you to be able to go out and tell people about CPI. I need you to be very successful in your life. I need you to, be very, to be very successful in your life. I need you to make good friends that you can trust. I need you to be better. That's what I'm trying to do. The synthetic left, again, it's kind of like what I talked about with Kamala Harris. The synthetic left wants to reduce you to being an obedient cog and a bitter, resentful, angry, scared person. I want you to be a confident person, a successful person, a creative person, an optimistic person. I want the opposite for you of what the synthetic left wants, right? We are cultivating you. Go read the growth booklet. Do you believe in growth, right? It's on our website.